Let me just give you a brief introduction of our panel speakers today. To begin with, our moderator, Mr. Arun Kumar. Mr. Arun Kumar is the managing partner of Celesta Capital USA with a wealth of experience in global investment strategies. Arun most recently served as the chairman and CEO of KPMG India and has previously served in President Obama's administration as Assistant Secretary of Commerce and Global Markets and Director General of US and Foreign Commercial Services. A quick welcome to our panelists, Ms. Shobana Kamineni, a leader in healthcare innovation. Shobana is the Executive Vice Chairperson of Apollo Hospitals, India. Welcome, Ms. Shobana.
Thank you.
Mr. Leo Puri, Chairman of Apax India, Singapore, bringing expertise in private equity and business growth. Welcome, Mr. Puri.
Thank you.
Professor C. Raja Mohan, a renowned scholar in international relations. He is a visiting professor, research professor of ISAC, National University of Singapore. Welcome, Mr. Mohan.
Thank you.
Ms. Erin Watson, Managing Director at Baker & York, Australia. She is well known for her insights in global market dynamics. Welcome, Ms. Watson.
Very much.
Dr. Mohammed, Dr. Mohammed Altaf, Director of Lulu Group International, Qatar, comes with extensive experience in retail and international trade. Welcome, Mr. Altaf.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
I'll just take a quick minute to introduce our team as well while everybody is here. Let me introduce our CEO of India entity, Mr. Sri Kumar Nair. Our Director of Community Relations and Development from Bombay, Preeta. Director Operations and Community Relations, Delhi, Manjula. Manager of Events, Shrenya. And we have our country head of Singapore, Bunty Chand. Thank you once again for joining us. We look forward to an engaging and enlightening discussion. I would like to hand over the session to Arun, who will moderate and take the session forward. Arun, here you go.
Yeah, thank you, Nisha. Let me first add my welcome to our distinguished panelists. Our panel will address many dimensions of what to expect or what we would like to see now that the election verdict is in and the government is in place. This is an exciting moment for India. The election and the transition are a testament to the competence of India's institutions and its democracy. And this government should have every motivation to promote stability and growth. Let me share some thoughts on what I believe this verdict implies. The electorate has asked for continuity and inclusiveness. We should expect and want the continuation of the progressive aspects of Modi 1.0 and 2.0. These include economic reforms, infrastructure development, social welfare programs, and aspects of foreign policy. Modi 1.0 and 2.0 can take credit for many economic reforms that were implemented, aimed at boosting growth and attracting investment. These include the GST, the Goods and Services Tax, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and measures to improve ease of doing business. Despite efforts, though, unfinished work remains to increase manufacturing's share of the economy and to expand exports and jobs. Labor, land, and agricultural reforms need significant work. Infrastructure development has been an area of marked success. The expansion of highways, ports, and rural roads are great examples. The Digital India Trust has been transformative with Aadhaar, UPI, and various e-governance services. Social welfare programs have advanced financial inclusion, affordable housing, and health coverage. And foreign policy has been proactive, engaging with major powers and neighboring countries, while also strengthening ties with countries in Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Defense and security priorities have included the modernization of the armed forces with a particular focus on indigenization of defense production. Rural development initiatives were focused on providing employment opportunities in rural areas. Former schemes were continued and expanded. In energy and environment saw progress in renewable energy production. Efforts have been made to promote clean energy and reduce pollution. Now, the imperative of inclusiveness covers several aspects. The states need to be engaged and involved in the national direction, as seen by the increasing importance of the regional parties. The states are the engines of economic growth, so this should be seen as a positive phenomenon. I know a lot of folks have had concerns about coalition governments, but to take a page from India's history, one must note that the inclusiveness demanded by coalition governments has created a record of successes, from the opening up of the economy under the Narasimha Rao government, to rationalizing customs and revamping telecom by the Vajpayee-led coalition, to launching Aadhaar by the Manmohan Singh government. The new government's plans should become clearer when the budget is presented for the current fiscal year, probably next month. So that's the backdrop of the last 10 years, and I'd love to now get to what our panelists see of the picture before us. So we'll start with the outside in. What is the geopolitical picture, and what will India's responses be, from diplomacy to trade policy? What kinds of shifts are we seeing in geopolitics? How will India navigate these? We cannot have a better thinker and commentator than Dr. Raja Mohan to speak on this. So Raja, over to you.
Thank you, Arun. It's wonderful to be here with all of you today to discuss the election and its consequences. I would highlight three broad points. One, I think the premature obituaries that were written for Indian democracy and the kind of incessant rhetoric in the West, including in the Beltway in Washington, that it is as if it is a confirmed truth that India is now backsliding on the democracy and that India is going to be an authoritarian state. I think both the critics and supporters of the government in India or outside have completely misread, underestimated the depth of Indian diversity and the capacity of the Indian voter to express that diversity in definitive forms. And I think that's what we've seen in this election, that Indian democracy is well and thriving, and that this is going to be, that this argument, which was beginning to cast a shadow over India's relationship with the West and mainly the Anglo-Saxon countries, that I think will now take a backseat, hopefully. And we saw yesterday Kurt Campbell, US Deputy Secretary of State, actually praising Indian democracy. So I think that argument has largely been put to rest. Second question on the coalition governments, will it weaken the government's ability to handle foreign policy? I don't think so. Foreign policies of countries do not change with every change of government. And I think the broad direction of foreign policy is set. If you look at the three broad areas, on Pakistan, there is quite a bit of agreement between Congress and BJP that cross-border terrorism is the key. On the US, they both agree on the need to build a more deeper, expansive relationship. On China, actually, there's been some divisiveness where actually the Congress party has attacked the BJP for being soft on China, for ceding territory. So in some senses, the internal room for any potential compromise with China has shrunk. So that's where we are broadly on the three big accounts of India's foreign policy. That brings me to the third point. I think where the challenge for India is going to be not the nature of the outcome of the election, but actually the external world is changing very, very rapidly. And I'm not sure whether the Indian elite fully sees the depth of this change, the urgency of needing to adapt to this. So I would just highlight, three broad things here. And first is the growing conflict between the major powers. Those of you who had a chance to see what happened at G7 yesterday, you saw the US actually, G7 has rallied around to signal a long-term commitment to Ukraine, impose a whole range of new sanctions against Russia, and the putting sanctions against third states, which might actually help Russia to fight the war against Ukraine. So until now, India has kind of ducked the core issues. We love the fence, as you know. Though we have moved so much closer to the West, on the Russia and the Ukraine questions, India has dodged the issues rather than confronted them. But my sense is that confrontation with the issues involved, I think, is not going to be very far. The question of India can simply trade with Russia while deepening ties with the US. I think this is going to come under some stress. The second set of issues, I think, the question of US-China relationship, the Taiwan crisis, what it does to our region. Here again, we're seeing the China question too narrowly in a bilateral sense, but my sense is there is a bigger dynamic here which India has to benefit or manage the consequences of a intensifying conflict between US and China. Finally, I would say the significant lack of attention in Delhi to the kind of economic policies that President Trump is promising to bring back. 10% tariff on all imports across the board. Okay, 60% for China, that's a special effect. So the structure that those who believe that the WTO type of trading regime that is gone, and that you're going to have an intensified trade conflict between US and China. And on that, for India to take advantage of it, to be able to deal with the domestic change in the US on trade policy requires, I think, far greater engagement with these issues, because India has not been trade friendly. And it is now has to take into account how does it deal with the opportunities that open up with China Plus One strategy or the so-called resilient supply chain. All this requires, while we pay lip service to some of these issues, the need for urgent action to be able to concentrate and make India a more attractive destination for capital that is looking to restructure itself. I think this is a big challenge. And I think both on the trade policy and making domestic environment more easy for Western capital to come in at this critical juncture, I think we need a lot of urgent action, not this relaxed approach that there's a complacence in Delhi that, okay, we are doing well and everybody's going to come here. But I think we might be badly mistaken. Looking at Southeast Asia has actually gained a lot more from the structural change. So I would say democracy question, there's no more debate. Second, on the character of this government, its ability to deal with the world, there is continuity. But finally, on the great power conflict, on the Russia question, on the China question, and on the trade question, India will need to move pretty quickly and pretty decisively in the coming weeks. I'll stop here.
Okay. Okay, no, thank you. That's a wonderful exposition, Raja. So now let's look at the prospects for the Indian economy. What policy changes should the new government prioritize to strengthen India's economic position globally and internally? So Leo Puri, who has a special perch, not only from a private equity leadership role, but also from the boards of large iconic companies, will share his thoughts. So Leo.
Thank you, Arun. And first, let me just say I completely agree that what we've got is probably the best possible outcome in terms of a stable coalition led by a strong party. So I think we're in a good starting position. But in terms of the economy, I'd say the hand that the new administration is dealt is a moderately good one. And let me just elaborate on that. While the headline growth has been about 8.2%, and we've seen that number, this is actually coming on the back of scarring from the pandemic. And we actually lost 6% during that year and had a low growth 4% the year before. So we're actually coming into this administration with an average of about 4.5% GDP growth per annum. So it's perhaps not as strong momentum as one would have ideally wished for, but it's decent in the global context, particularly given the last year or so. And there is something to celebrate. I think there's some good news around what's happening with infrastructure and housing, which is leading to construction activity. Services exports are doing well too. And of course, the financial sector has repaired its balance sheet and corporate profits remain strong. So there's a decent foundation there. But to sort of understand what might be happening next, we need to understand the composition of that growth. And I think that gives us a good clue as to how the government is going to have to think about the next steps. Most of the growth, in fact, has actually been driven at this point from what you're seeing is a pattern where consumption essentially is dropping off and it's investment-led. Not a bad thing in itself, but you've essentially had public investment driving growth. And over time, consumption has actually been tailing off. So it's driven by profits over wages in a sense, urban growth versus rural growth. And the capital intensity has been growing in that process. And the relative attractiveness of labor as a factor of production has been dropping. And that is obviously a political problem and also helps to explain some of the loss of support that the government has seen because ultimately employment is what people care about. And it's also meant that if relative income is moving from sections of society which have a propensity to consume to those who have less propensity, because if it's shifting in terms of income equality to the top end of the pyramid, these are people who are actually spending less. So you've actually seen consumption dropping at about 4.3% over the last 5 years, below investment and exports. So what you'd expect to see is a government that will need to find ways to bring consumption back. And the path to that lies, frankly, through making labor a more attractive factor of production. And that is an absolutely central aspect of what we have to look for going forward. So when you look even out at the next 2 or 3 months, what are some of the signs that we'll have to look for here? The first tactical step is going to be around minimum support prices for agriculture. Most of the jobs that have got created in the last few years have actually been agriculture. So not very high quality jobs, but clearly better than nothing. It's possible you might see a little bit of populism here because this is a quick way to stimulate the agrarian economy. And while the government knows that this distorts prices and the structure of the economy, it's quite likely that there will be some SOPs, I think, offered in terms of support prices for agriculture. But I think what much of India will look for is obviously the budget. And the question is, what could we expect here? Again, the starting point is quite good. I think one of the achievements of the last administration was fiscal consolidation. And we probably will achieve the 5.1% that was actually laid out. So macro administration has remained very strong throughout the last decade, in fact, not just the last 5 years. And I think the world now expects us to continue that. And I think there's been a tactical boost with about 30 basis points from an RBI dividend, which some of you might have heard about. And while it is an accounting sleight of hand in some sense, it does allow the government some flexibility to achieve its fiscal targets going forward. So the question is, how would you expect them to spend that? A good part of this will be in the near term to continue the public investment program, because I think they're already, if you like, have enough momentum behind that. Some part of this may actually be increased welfare to the bottom of the pyramid. And frankly, there, as long as that is well managed, well targeted, that may not be a terrible thing. And there is room here to do this, provided the tax to GDP ratio remains healthy, and it's been trending healthily at now above 18%. But it also means there's very little room for tax cuts. And I think it'll be interesting to see how the government deals with that, because obviously there are expectations, as always, in both corporate and individual corporate and households of some reduction in direct taxes. Personally, I see very little room for that, given the need to keep both public investment and potentially targeted welfare remaining at, if anything, elevated levels. So the room to reduce that is very low. The other area to look at is manufacturing and trade policy. I think we have had, of course, a lot of discussion around China +1 and the opportunities that presents India. And some of the catalysts, such as the PLI, production-linked incentives, which are controversial, but they have probably helped many sections of the Indian economy react to that opportunity. There are some who argue that this is not sustainable. Raghuram Rajan, who I respect enormously, has written a book almost dedicated to the point that for India to rely on manufacturing-led growth would be unrealistic, because the world is not ready for another large country to step into the export market. So repeating what China has done is impossible. Now, while I agree with that, I also can't see how the government can avoid stimulating manufacturing if you accept the thesis that the path to future growth lies in making labor a more attractive factor of production and generating employment. So I think you will see, in fact, continued effort for India to play, and this is where some of what I think was discussed in the geopolitics discussion comes into play. We do want to be a reliable, friendly ally and become an important part of supply chains to the extent that we can. And I think we will continue to pursue that policy. When people talk of reforms, they usually think of medium-term factors of production, land, labor, logistics, and power, and so on. These are areas that actually involve the states ultimately. So one thing to look for is how will that relationship continue to strengthen and evolve? It's probably fortunate we have several ex-chief ministers of states now in the cabinet. I personally think that's a very positive sign. It's also a positive sign that at least two of the coalition leaders will continue to lead their states in Andhra Pradesh and Bihar. And I think that's, again, incredibly positive, actually. Because post, Mr. Jaitley's absence, one of the challenges this government has had is finding a consistent way to integrate the states into economic development. And this has to be a joint effort. I think it's going to be a litmus test of the ability of this government now to govern the country successfully, that the relationship between the center and states is perhaps more cooperative, coordinated, and they work in unison. Because without that, just given the federal structure of the Constitution, factor reforms are truly impossible. And this was proven in the last administration. So I think these are some of the things you should expect to see. I think bringing labor back to the center is where politics and economics meets. There is going to be a focus on employment. Therefore, there's going to be a focus on getting labor as opposed to just capital to drive the economy, and hence education, skilling, health, and many of those things will come right into the center of the frame, which I think we'll talk about a little further. So back to you on that note, Arun.
Thank you, Leo. That sets it up perfectly for our next speaker. So from the overall economy, we'll now look at critical challenges and opportunities. So which sectors hold the most opportunities and challenges? And what needs to be done in areas like skills and employment? On this topic, there aren't too many better individuals to speak than Shobna Kamneni, who has served as the president of the CII, in addition to her leadership role in India's largest private hospitals and healthcare group, the Apollo Group. So Shobna, to you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Arun, and hello to all the diaspora watching this, watching today. And really, I couldn't have asked for a better segue than Leo speaking so articulately on the whole Indian economy and spotlighting jobs. And I do endorse that in the context of this this question. It's really not just the Indian demographics, but also the election result that just concluded. The underlying message was that Indians don't want doles and subsidies as much as they want jobs. And I think the election, earlier in my state of Telangana, that was completely on the bedrock of jobs. Same thing we saw in the state election of Andhra Pradesh, that they were really looking at job creation. So how would this play out? So one is that, every time I go to the government and I talk about the health, about the services sector and say, hey, look, it's bringing you so many jobs. And they say, no, manufacturing is really what India wants. So they're completely in love with manufacturing. And whether it's the PLI or the offset agreements, China Plus One, the enthusiasm for that, I think this is a sector that will definitely grow. And whether it's defense, chips, EVs, and components, it's really become a sexy area for Indians. And I think that there's so many, moving into this sector. So it will help us. I'm really not sure where the jobs will come from that, because if you see most of the countries, people are losing jobs to automation in the sector. But I think manufacturing is significantly That's a sector that we lost out to for many, many decades. And the importance of this for our GDP and for our economy is important. But I move on to the construction sector. And I think this is the real this is the real sector that creates jobs. We give jobs to 32 million people here. And you know, lots of migration happens. It's not that skilled, and this will continue. The growth of China for many decades again came from construction. So I like the fact that India has invested heavily over the last 10 years in infrastructure. This will continue. The real estate sector in India, you still have so many millions of Indians that need houses. And I think that this is a sector that will continue to lead in job creation. Agriculture, as Leo said, so important to feed 1.6 million of our countrymen. Have we got it right? I'm really not sure that anyone can get that right, because there's so much of you know, that it's about timing, it's about climate change, and really it's about cultural. It's about the way that we're doing irrigation projects. There's so much that goes into it. I think that what we really need is a higher level of dialogue and people coming together so that we can avoid the tragedies that took place in the latter half of this of the government of, you know, the last 5 years. But again, it's a sector that, you know, even though so much of it is really not in the formal sector, but it provides families with jobs. And I like the fact that if we can continue to keep people in rural areas, the social structure of India becomes a whole lot better. And this is something that we've seen in consumption. Today in consumption, if we look at it, there are it's the rural the rural economy is really there's a lot of consumption happening there also. Most of it is driven by small jobs, by agriculture and allied jobs. So this is an interesting place for India to actually double down on, and I do think there's opportunity for us to grow our rural sector very strongly. Having said that, I'm a true believer that urbanization, that if we concentrate not just on the 5 big metros, on the next 15 metros, that's where the growth will come. That's where consumption will happen. That's where jobs will be created. So we do need to double down on how we look at rural and urban growth over there. So there's an area that we have to address. Again, I moved very fast between all these other sectors because I really wanted to spend time in an area that I know better, and that's services. So services has constantly been actually contributing to over 50% of India's GDP. I think that it's a sector that, while it has the current challenges of reskilling, of huge tectonic shifts that are happening because of AI and all the other new technologies coming in, it's still an area that requires also not just high tech, but it requires high touch. And this is something that I think India would be very good at. And I want to lead in this sector by just one little story. We were in a dialogue with an ambassador to China, and I kind of asked him. I said, you know, everything we talk about China +1, we talk about this thing, but I don't think they really fear that we're going to be able to compete at that scale with them. What worries China about India? And he turned around and said that what worries China most is the Indian human quotient. They've seen that, you know, you look at your diaspora, they've seen that we are the dominant diaspora in the world, that we have global leaders in every sector. They're saying that, you know, you give Indians a chance to use their capacity, their mental capacity, and they will really be a superpower to the world. But the only thing is that when they get it right, that's the time we have to fear. So I'm hoping that the services sector will get it right. And in the services sector, while you look at logistics and retail, just to give you an example, quick commerce never worked anywhere in the world. Today in India, what took me, I have a chain of pharmacies, and I have 6,000 pharmacies. It took us 30 years to get to 800,000 customers a day. The quick commerce guys, of course, it's in groceries and not in pharmaceuticals, but they are doing today. The largest one is doing about 700,000 deliveries a day. So collectively, they're doing almost 2 million deliveries. So this is all in 4 years. So I think that the ability for India to scale in logistics and retail is going to be huge. It's going to be an opportunity. And fortunately now the tide has turned, that no one is going to allow them to play out with other people's money. They will start making profit. So the formalization of the retail sector is going to be an opportunity. And last, about healthcare. So I think that healthcare is really a sector that has huge potential. By 2030, they say there'll be a shortage of almost 18 million healthcare professionals around the world. And I think that in many countries post the pandemic, the expertise has been declining. I mean, people coming into nursing, people coming into tech, into the paramedic areas has been decreasing. India has an opportunity to bridge that. And I really hope this will play out by better education, by the policies that we have. And we just need to get more doctors out there. We need to be able to train them, and the nurses and the paramedics. India for the graying world. It's a term you've heard. Medical tourism, people coming into India for healthcare. I think it's a sector that not only will grow, but it'll grow for good. It'll grow for good jobs. It'll grow to help people. It'll grow to keep countries healthy and humanity healthy. So for all these wonderful reasons, I just want to close what I say with this passionate outreach, that I do think that healthcare is to me a huge opportunity for India. And in conclusion, all of you have been around for so long. How long have you heard that there are going to be 11 million young Indians coming into the workforce every year? So just imagine, we've never hit that target of providing for 11, 12 million jobs. Now with the reports that have come out, whether it's McKinsey, World Economic Forum, Bain, you name it, all of them say with the jobs will now, with reskilling, with the change, with AI, the jobs will decrease. So I think we have to find, India needs to double down, just like Leo said. We need this government to be able to spend time to have very good dialogues, to give us the same kind of excitement that the service sector can provide jobs for many millions of Indians. And hopefully, just like Altaf, who's there from Lulu, how many Indians you've taken to the Middle East? Like that, I think that we can do this across sectors. And Indians, the Indian diaspora, not only is hardworking, but kind of assimilates into societies. I could see so many of them at the cricket match actually rooting for the US. I mean, it just shows, and that's the spirit of the way that we should be. So jobs, I think that is a very, very important subject. Thank you, Arun. Thank you, Diaspora, for giving me this opportunity to be able to talk about a sector that I'm quite passionate about.
No, thank you, Shobna, for your wide-ranging comments. And I love that story about the human quotient and the Chinese ambassadors' observations. Now let's move on to the Middle East. The Middle East holds increased importance for India, and enhanced economic cooperation can be a game changer. We often think that when we talk about the US-India corridor, the Middle East can be a nice node in the middle of that. Now, Prime Minister Modi recognized this early in his tenure, and he's visited several times. Dr. Mohammed Altaf, while he helps run a global business, Lulu, which goes all the way from the US to India, he is located in the heart of the Middle East, based in Doha. He and his chairman have worked closely with India's leaders as India enhanced its engagement in the Gulf countries. I'd love to hear his thoughts on India and the Middle East, the opportunities, the challenges, political and economic. Altaf.
Thank you, Arun. Thank you for that introduction. I am very delighted to see all of you here. Like Arun said, I'm joining from Qatar, and it's a very particularly interesting place to discuss Indian elections. Qatar nationals are about 400,000, and we have 700,000 Indian citizens living in Qatar. So, and from every state representing diverse social, linguistics, and economic background. So this election and its results have been eagerly followed and debated in this region, generating significant interest even from the local Qatari media. So the reason is one of Prime Minister Modi's notable achievements, as Arun just mentioned, over the past decade has been placing GCC as the entire GCC countries at the core of his foreign policy. Interestingly, he was the first Prime Minister to visit UAE in 34 years, and he has done multiple visits after that. And then he is the only Prime Minister to have visited Qatar twice in his tenure, again followed by Saudi Arabia, different visits. And we also had UAE President visiting as the head of our, as the guest of honor for our Republic Day. So all that has, all this is fostering a lot of interactions and interest between the two regions. And that is naturally leading to a lot of curiosity about what is happening in the elections in India. Now, just to give a context, historically, the relationship between Middle East and India was always based on three elements simply. That was manpower, remittance, and oil. Now, this relationship is evolving significantly. First of all, the reason the Gulf economies have diversified away from their hydrocarbon dependence through promotion of trade, digital service, travel, hospitality, and a lot of other services in this region. And these states are pursuing ambitious programs to transform their economies by embracing new technologies, leveraging their strategic locations and for global trade and connectivity. So you will find a lot of new smart cities coming up like NEOM. We have Lusail in Qatar. There are a lot of other cities planned in Oman now. And the cooperation between India and the GCC in areas such as food and energy security, space research, and other strategic sectors, all are now coming up in a big way. So, and also we have to remember that no other country or the region has provided such an open access to India for its labor market and for our exports. So that is one of our key factors now that is shaping up our relationship now. Now, recently there is also significant changes in our increasing investment flow now coming out of India to the Middle East as well. For instance, in the recent real estate boom, I'm sure you probably heard about Dubai and other cities, #1 investment has come from India. And according to Dubai Chamber of Commerce, and I'm sure this is true of all other chambers in the Middle East, that 30% of the total startups registered in the UAE are from Indian entrepreneurs. And again, in sectors like logistics, warehousing, transportation, consumer durables now, Indian companies have invested well over 50% of the total investment in the last 3 years. So all these investments, this is also need to be considered in this relationship now. India is now contributing to the growth of this region, aiding the efforts of its economic diversification. And now we are not the only recipients now. I mean, if you look at now, even today, our this money that is flowing into India is significant. I think last year it was about 135 billion, close to 2 to 3% of the GDP of India. And if you add another bank deposits, so that is another, it can add another 2% to our GDP. So that is also very important. But at the same time now, Indian investment is also coming to this region now. Now, after the election, there was a lot of, a lot of the government and, the investment institution here took it for granted that Indian election is going to be very predictable. So they were just continuing as nothing is going to change. But then now, after the election, we need to look at the post-election expectation that this region has now. Our trade and economic relations with UAE, have been very strong, and we already signed up with Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement in 2022. We also established the local currency settlement system last year, but for other regions, they are still waiting. So immediately after this election, people are expecting there is an FTA to be announced with Oman. So that was pending for a long time. We hope that is going to come through. And there is also a discussion about all the GCC Cooperation Council countries. So all the 6 countries entering into some kind of a FTA agreement with India. So, and moreover, the ongoing discussions about India's relationship with Middle East, particularly in the context of the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. I think, that is another thing that we need to keep in mind, that, India will get much better access if they have some kind of a base in all the free zones that they have developed in the region. So I would say that, this comprehensive economic cooperation treaty that was in UAE, it still remain a priority. I hope it will still remain a priority for the new government. And our side also will appreciate the high level of complementarity between our 2 economies. Now, if you look at now, Middle East is also looking with this extraordinary geopolitical crisis that is going on, climate change in some of these areas like Egypt and Lebanon and all other areas. So they all need food security. They need their supply chain resiliency. And a lot of people are moving away from Europe because of the conflicts, and plus because of certain economic policies that they're following. So there is also an expectation for increased investments, strategic partnerships, again, a few more partnerships with space organizations, and even stronger economic ties. So as we continue to navigate these dynamic landscapes, I'm sure the opportunities for collaboration and growth will be immense. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Altaf. Now, from politics and economics, let's turn to the technology dimension. Personally, I believe that issues and opportunities relating to technology will be as important to countries as those relating to trade. India and the US, for instance, have prioritized an initiative to collaborate on emerging and critical technologies. And in the G20, India and the G20 countries formulated approaches for collaboration in technology. Erin Watson has studied and written about how, for instance, the India Stack can promote global economic integration. So let's hear her perspectives on how India can enhance its collaborations with other countries to foster innovation and economic growth. Erin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me okay. I am really grateful for you inviting me here. I don't know if it's obvious or not, but I am not from the Indian diaspora. So I'm very grateful to come here and share my views. But having said that, India has also very much been a second home of mine. I'm a long-time student of India, having written a PhD on the country and been in and out of the country for 12 years. I've run a small business there, and I still work with companies on India today. So I feel very humbled to join. If it helps, my husband's Sri Lankan, but I'm not going to enter into a conversation about who has better food. So this is not the forum. But I am here to talk about tech, and I am here to talk to you about UPI in particular is something I really am interested in talking about. And I think it's an emerging, not even emerging anymore. It is an emerged trend out of India that I think that the rest of the world is still trying to even hear about in the first instance, let alone catch up or let alone integrate. So that's really what I want to talk about today. And, my first big observation before I get into the guts of this is just how digital public infrastructure has really changed my own experience of coming and going from India. It has fundamentally changed for someone like me, and that's not to disregard the experience of people who are in rural areas or urban poor, and there are a whole bunch of dynamics there. But for me, I can turn up in India now. It is so much safer. I can move around. I can pay people a lot easier. It really is extraordinary what's happened in the last not even quite 10 years when it comes to DPIs. So I've often reflected on this and have written extensively about it. And I would just want to make, before I get into, I guess I want to make 3 points starting at that period post demonetization. you know, where India has landed since then and where I think we should be going. As much as I can get people on the outside to listen to me about where I think we should be going when it comes to economic integration with India. So the first one is actually just to pick up on this political dynamic, because this is what we're all here to talk about, which is this post-election piece. And, you know, on election night was up watching, you know, the numbers come in, and it was just, you know, it was just, it kind of points to some really key factors about how, you know, on the outside, certainly looking at through the lens of Western media, perhaps didn't quite fully grasp the dynamics on the ground. And the first point I want to make is really that everything that has happened, and I will rehash some of the high level point, like the high level numbers in a minute, but just that broader piece that there is an element of Narendra Modi's political capital that enabled this kind of change to happen in such a short period of time. And perhaps when we look at it from the outside, or if I make observations about analysts who are not so familiar with really being on the ground in India, this is where people saw this as like a democratic backsliding. It's sort of like if you've got more of an autocratic democracy or an autocratic leader, then it's much easier to lift 250 million people out of poverty because you can take money out of the economy. And although in hindsight, I often still wonder if it was a long-term strategy or these things happened by chance and it worked out. But I do think that's where some of these observations came from. And that Raj have talked about this earlier, but you know, there's kind of this fundamental lack of understanding of the democratic culture in India and how recent, really, I mean, 70 years is still relatively recent when it comes to independence, and how that is still really held as a fundamental part of the way people feel about their democracy in India. And so, you know, it was almost like the outside observed Indian voters as mugs a little bit, like, oh, they're just, you know, looking for a Modi figure, but it's actually not. So I think that's the first thing, is that, you know, and if you look at this retrospectively as well about, you know, we all sort of, it's easy to analyze the scenario and say this is more of an autocratic leader, but Modi still wasn't able to liberalize, you know, parts of the economy domestically, which tells me actually he probably knows that he doesn't have the capital that we all sort of see him having on the outside. So I could be right or wrong in that observation, and I would love to hear what people think. But you know, I think that's the first thing, is that how could this happen in such a short period of time? So this is where I come to UPI, and I talk about this. Look, I probably mention UPI daily to people. I'm obsessed with it. But for everyone who needs a bit of refresher on the scale of this, right, with, you know, of the scale of UPI now, in India, 68% of transactions are conducted using UPI. And in August 2023, last year, there were over 10.6 billion transactions in that month alone. So like the scale is just enormous. And the other thing that all of this has led to is that bank ownership in India is now 78%, which is really high. That's actually high compared to a lot of other more developed economies. And there's zero gender gap, but there was quite a big gender gap before around who had access to bank accounts. So again, that's really just really transformed who has access to money, who has access to who is able to consume, who gets to make those consumer choices, and so on. And the reason I talk about those numbers so frequently is that one thing we talk about in Australia and other, you know, countries like, you know, the US and so on, is that this idea of how do we integrate better economic, how do we move money in and out of India more easily? And fundamentally, this actually is about the movement of people. This is about, India has the biggest diaspora in the world. Everybody is everywhere. This is about remittance payments. It's about consumption. But fundamentally, the thing that's driving this is the diaspora. And so we've seen in countries like Singapore, the central banks between Singapore and India, DBS being the first mover, got Singapore onto UPI. Now, there are issues around liquidity and so on, and so there are these limits and caps on how much can move, but the fact that they've done it is really incredible, and sort of showed that Singapore was willing to make that commitment to the Indian system, which is the economic system. This is how India consumes and how Indians move money around. So Singapore has done it. Other South Asian countries, I understand, have done it to a lesser extent, and France has an MOU in place, although I'm not quite sure how far that's actually got. But the way I kind of sort of try and explain this to people, because for me, I've run a business in India where I've had to get to India and take money out of the bank before, and it's actually a complete pain to do. So you go down to Select City Walk and you go to the Citibank ATM and you take out 20,000 chunks of rupees so that you can pay for accommodation and all these kinds of things along your way. So it's less about me because I can't get onto UPI because I'm not an NRI. I'm not Indian. But it is, again, like I said, it's about people. So the way I often think about it is, you will all remember Jasmine, the just looking like a wow lady. Everyone would have seen that go viral. Now, if you're in the diaspora in Australia and you see her, you see her store and you want to be able to buy from your store, if you were able to integrate with UPI in Australia, you'd be able to more easily move your money into India, which can take weeks. I had a payment come from India and it took like 6 weeks or something ridiculous like that, because there was just so much paperwork. So those kinds of that fluidity of people and the desire for Indian goods and those kinds of things can happen a little bit more easily. What does this mean though under the next government? So this is the third thing I'd like to mention, is that I don't think there is going to be much change here. And I think that if anything, where we need to see political will, it's actually on a different side of things. I've talked about in papers before about how important getting something like this up off the ground is all to do with political will and the willingness of, because what India's essentially done is leapfrogged payment systems that we have in Australia. Our payments system is under reform at the moment. It hasn't been looked at since 1998. So when you look at our payment system, it's all of these kind of additive little pieces and everyone gets to take money, clip money along as they go. Whereas India kind of leapfrogged all of that from a fundamentally different ideology, which was open source technology, that people could innovate, on top of. So there is this really big difference there, but actually countries like Australia have very antiquated systems. And this idea of moving money in this way is hard for them to get their heads around. We can't even do digital ID in Australia, like let alone, when I think 1.3 billion people are on Aadhaar in India. So that's a really big challenge. And I do believe that this has got to be driven by someone in the private sector who is willing to integrate it into their banking, like DBS did in Singapore, has to say, we're going to integrate this technology and I'm going to be the first movers on UPI. Do they make any money out of UPI? No, but they get customer acquisition, they get customer retention, which is, the group of people who are our largest source of migrants in Australia, the Indian diaspora. So I do think that this is less of, I don't see any impact on the Indian side, but what I see that needs to be done is this educative piece in the more developed economies where there's big Indian diasporas. I will stop there. Happy to take any questions, but I'm really passionate about this and seeing this integration happen. So hopefully, people in this room can sort of start to get that out into the other countries as well, where this could actually have a really big impact on people.
No, thank you, Erin. So it's been a great discussion. I think we've almost run out of time, but I wanted to pick 2 or 3 key themes. One, and I just focus on three of the panelists here. One, Shobna, you mentioned services as something that needs more focus, and all the talk is about manufacturing. And I think you implied that maybe there should be more mobility in services like we have in the Middle East. How feasible is that? And do you think that will happen with regard to the countries in the West? And so that's my first question to you. Then I'll go on to Raja and finally Leo.
Really quick, we actually do a program with the University of Queensland Med School and in India, and we twin to give them a joint degree. I think that this should be the future of saying that let students study for a couple of years in both countries and give them a joint medical degree. There's another program which I think the NHS has been trying for a long time, is to be able to get healthcare workers to go temporarily, like doctors, into the NHS, work for 2 years so that they don't, give them a chance later to immigrate. But right now, it's on a 2-year or a 4-year visa, and then they come back. So these are strong ways that we can get. And the Middle East, of course, they recognize some of these degrees. We're working on a program with Indonesia that the Indian degrees will be registered. But the whole thing, Arun, is that we're doing it ourselves. We've seen that, we're getting very little government support on some of these initiatives. So it can only be done to a certain amount, and that's not enough. We need to really think about this and rethink about. So then what happens is we'll rethink about how we educate people. So if you look at it, again, another story, the richest MP today in India is a guy who has the thing for USMLE. So his company is worth $1 billion. He's worth, and that's the thing. Just training Indians to be able to take the American degree. So I rest my case. I think that this should be done at scale. There's huge opportunity, not just in the high end, but in home care workers for Japan. Many of these.
Thank you, Kalpana. Thank you, Shobna. And you talked about jobs, and so did Leo and Raja. So jobs was kind of a common theme through the conversations. Now, one of the ways in which you can create good jobs is through increasing exports, and not enough of that has happened. To do that, free trade agreements or regional agreements are a way. And Raja, what is your view on, is that going to happen as a way to increase jobs?
Look, I think, this government, the BJP government came 10 years ago, actually pretty hostile to free trade agreements. But then it did join, it inherited the negotiations on the RCEP. It looked like they were going to sign it. Then they walked away in the last minute. But since then, I think there have been some movement forward in the Australia, UAE, and EFTA, not the classical trade agreements, but some of them, EFTA one was really investment-driven one. So there's some change. And the India-EU negotiations, of course, are pretty tough. No one is expecting a big breakthrough. It looked like India-UK thing would come through at some point, but that didn't. I doubt if the Labour will be as enthusiastic as the Tories. So I wonder if the big moment has passed. But I think I would say this is not, again, going back to the WTO style of trade regime, because US is not for it. That framework is gone. So the question is, look, if you're going to be a large economy, what is the kind of trading structures you need to build with the key other economies? With China, we have a problem, which is getting worse by the year. This year was $100 billion trade deficit. Our surpluses are with the West and the Western allies. The question is then, can we negotiate a way in which we can do more with our Western partners? The US too is hostile to FTAs in a classical sense. But can we expand trade? Can we take measures that will actually help move things? So I would say look for practical expansion of trade rather than looking at the formal trade agreements, which I think, in any case, even those India negotiated are pretty shallow agreements. So you have a large economy. The others are looking away from China. So how do we get investment and manufacturing within India so that will automatically begin to expand the overall footprint globally? So I think, but I don't see a coherent strategy yet. This is where I think there are those who criticize the government for not doing enough FTAs, those who say, look, we have to save ourselves from China, so therefore you invest in PLI. But somewhere, more energy into negotiating trade liberalization agreements with friendly Western countries, because that's where the complementarity is, that's where our surpluses are. So I would say focus more on that rather than an abstract sense, are we for free trade or not?
Yeah. And let me come to the last point. So Leo, you talked about fiscal consolidation. Stability as having been a strong feature of the last 10 years. With all the geopolitical issues related to Ukraine, and especially the conversations at the G7, Do you see any consequences for the Indian rupee?
So I think there's undoubtedly consequences for India in geopolitical terms, which of course Raja Mohan is best qualified to answer. But my view is India will get more aligned and not be given this so-called Jordan pass indefinitely. As a result of that, possibly we will get more integrated into supply chains. As we get more integrated into supply chains, we might see some ability to defend the currency. I think the exogenous factor there, Arun, is the way the US is likely to act post the elections, which is, of course, not something India can control. The reality is a so-called, exorbitant privilege that they have means the dollar could actually end up strengthening dramatically, frankly, and India will not be able to do too much about that in terms of protecting the currency. So there's a bunch of things India can do, which I think we will do, and macro stability and growth are our best defense to protect our currency. But we are still at the mercy of the US and what happens to US rates and the way that I believe, most likely Trump administration will actually act in terms of economic and currency management. So we will remain, unfortunately, a price taker in that result.
Thank you. So that I think we just got 2 or 3 minutes over time. So thank you, Shobna, Leo, Erin, Raja, and Altaf. And let me now turn it over to my good friend Bunty to close the meeting.
I think somebody has to let me in. Okay.
You're in.
I cannot start the video because somebody, okay, I can now do that. I just want to say very quickly that may I thank Arun for a wonderful moderation this afternoon and a very erudite panel, Leo, Raja, Shobna, Altaf, and Erin. And there were learnings plenty from this afternoon. And I just want to reiterate that all the this panel discussion is available on Indiaspora's YouTube channel. And the Indian elections were an incredibly complex and a long process. And but what I think surprised the world was that the voice of the electorate was very clearly heard, and that Erin mentioned, called it the democratic culture, even though India has only been sort of independent for 70 years, but obviously the constitution matters to the people of India. And with that, I'm going to end the program. And I just want to say to the panel that please stay online because we're going to take a photograph for our records. And I do want to thank the audience for joining us from wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Give me a minute. I'm just spotlighting the team. Sorry for the technical glitch. I'm so sorry.
So you'll have to say cheese at some point.
Yeah. Oh, that's it. I am not able to get all of them. I'm so sorry. So where are? Say
I
cheese.
mean, I don't see Arun.
I can see Arun right on top.
Okay.
Say cheese.
Just
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
For your
Thank you, Arun.
Thank
you, everyone.
Bye,
Thank you.
Altaf. Bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Leo.
Thank you.
Shobna.
Bye, Leo. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you.